Hey guys, welcome. It's Dr. Seuss's birthday, so I figured why not read some of his books that you might not have heard of and one you would definitely have. And I'll give you some stuff you can watch afterwards that you might enjoy. Right, so first one is called The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins by Dr. Seuss. This is like one of those first books. I think it was actually the second book that he wrote. In the beginning, Bartholomew Cubbins didn't have 500 hats. He had only one hat, and it was an old one that belonged to his father and his father's father before him. It was probably the oldest and plainest hat in the whole kingdom of Did, where Bartholomew Cubbins lived. But Bartholomew liked it, especially because of the feather that always pointed straight up in the air. There's his hat. It's very plain. The kingdom of Did was ruled by King Derwin. His palace stood high on top of the mountain. From his balcony he looked down over the houses of all his subjects. First over the spires of the noblemen's castles, across the broad roofs of the rich man's mansions, then over the little houses of the townfolk to the huts of the farmers afar off in the fields. It was a mighty view, and it made King Derwin feel mighty important. There he is looking at his mighty view. Far off in the fields, on the edge of Cranberry Bog, stood the hut of the Cubbins family. From the small door, Bartholomew looked across the huts of the farmers to the houses of the townfolk, then to the rich men's mansions, to the noblemen's castles, up to the great towering palace of the king. It was exactly the same view that King Derwin saw from his balcony, but Bartholomew saw it backwards. It was a mighty view, but it made Bartholomew Cubbins feel mighty small. There he is looking back the other way. Just after sunrise Saturday morning, Bartholomew started for town. He was very happy. A pleasant breeze whistled through the feather of his hat. In his right hand he carried a basket of cranberries to sell at the market. He was anxious to sell them quickly and bring the money back home to his parents. He walked faster and faster until he got to the gates of town. The sound of silver trumpets rang through the air. Hoofbeats clattered the cobbled street. Clear the way, make way for the king. There he is walking as fast as he can, and they're clearing the path for the king. All the people rushed for the sidewalk. They drove their carts right up to the curbstones. Bartholomew clutched his basket tighter. Around the corner dashed 50 trumpeters on yellow-robed horses. Behind them, a crimson-robed horses came the king's own guards. Hats off to the king, shouted the captain of the king's own guards. On came the king's carriage, white and gold and purple. It rumbled like thunder through the narrow streets. It swept past Bartholomew. Then suddenly its mighty brakes shrieked. It lurched and then it stopped. The whole procession stood still. Bartholomew could hardly believe what he saw. Through the side window of the carriage, the king himself was staring straight back at him. Bartholomew began to tremble. Back up, the king commanded the royal coachman. The royal coachman shouted to the royal horses. The king's own guard shouted to their crimson-robed horses. The trumpeters shouted to their yellow-robed horses. Very slowly, the whole procession backed down the street until the king's carriage stopped right in front of Bartholomew. There's the king looking at something out of his carriage, and he looks kind of annoyed, maybe? The king leaned from his carriage window and fixed his eyes directly on Bartholomew Cubbins. Well, he demanded. Bartholomew shook with fright. I ought to say something, he thought to himself, but he could think of nothing to say. Well, demanded the king again, do you or do you not take off your hat before your king? Yes, indeed, sire, answered Bartholomew, feeling greatly relieved. I do take my hat off before my king. Then take it off this very instant, commanded the king more loudly than ever. But, sire, my hat is off, answered Bartholomew. Such impudence, shouted the king, shaking his angry finger. How dare you stand there and tell me your hat is off? I don't like to say you're wrong, sire, said Bartholomew very politely, but you see, my hat is off. And he showed the king the hat in his hand. If that's your hat in your hand, demanded the king, then what's that on your head? On my head, gasped Bartholomew. There did seem to be something on his head. He reached up his hand and touched a hat. So there he is with his red hat in his hands, but then another red hat on his head. The face of Bartholomew Cubbins turned very red. It's a hat, sire, he stammered, but it can't be mine. Someone behind me must have put it on my head. I don't care how it got there, said the king. You take it off. And the king sat back in his carriage. Bartholomew quickly snatched off the hat. He stared at it in astonishment. It was exactly the same as his own hat. The same size, the same color, and it had exactly the same feather. By the crown of my fathers, roared the king, again leaning out the carriage window, did I or did I not command you to take off your hat? You did, sire. I took it off. I took it off twice. Nonsense. There it is. There's still a hat upon your head. Another hat? Again Bartholomew reached up his hand and touched a hat. Come, come, what is the meaning of all this? Demanded the king. His face was purple and with rage. I don't know, sire, answered Bartholomew. It never happened to me before. The king was now shaking with such fury that the carriage rocked on its wheels, and the royal coachman could hardly sit in the seat. Arrest this impudent trickster, shouted the king to the captain of the king's own guards. We'll teach him to take his hat off. So there he is with the three hats. Two in his hands, one on his head. The royal coachman cracked his long whip. The king's carriage swung forward up the street towards the palace, but the captain of the king's own guard leaned down from his big brass saddle and grabbed Bartholomew Cubbins by the shirt. Away flew Bartholomew's basket. The cranberries bounced all over the cobblestone and rolled down into the gutter. With a jingling of spurs and a clatter of horseshoes, the captain and Bartholomew sped up the winding street towards the palace. Out of the narrow streets, on up the hill, Bartholomew clung to the captain's broad back. On and on they galloped, past the bright gardens of the wealthy merchants, higher and higher up the mountain, on past the walls of the noblemen's castles. So there is the captain of the king's own guard grabbing at Bartholomew to take him to the palace. Flop, the sharp wind whisked off Bartholomew's hat. Flop, flop, two more flew off. Flop, 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 flew another, and another. 4, 5, 6, 7. Bartholomew kept counting as the hats came faster and faster. Lords and ladies stared from the windows of their turrets, wondering what the strange stream of hats could mean. Over the palace drawbridge they sped, through the great gates and into the courtyard. The captain pulled in his reins. His Majesty waits in the throne room, said the guard, saluting the captain. The throne room, the captain dropped Bartholomew to the ground. I'd certainly hate to be in your shoes, he said, shaking his head sadly. For a moment, Bartholomew was terribly frightened. Still, he thought to himself, the king can do nothing dreadful to punish me because I really haven't done anything wrong. It would be cowardly to feel afraid. Bartholomew threw back his shoulders and marched straight ahead into the palace. Follow the black carpet, said the guard at the door. And all through the long hallway, Bartholomew could hear the muttering of voices behind every door. He won't take off his hat. No, he won't take off his hat. So there he is, going through the streets of the village, hats flying off behind him. Bartholomew walked on till he stood in the very middle of the throne room. The king, in a long scarlet robe, was sitting on his throne. Beside him stood Sir Alaric, keeper of the king's records. He wore in his belt, instead of a sword, a long silver ruler. The lords and noblemen of the court stood solemn and silent. The king looked down at Bartholomew severely. Young man, I'll give you one more chance. Will you take off your hat for your king? Your Majesty, said Bartholomew as politely as he could. I will, but I'm afraid it won't do any good. And he took off his hat, and it didn't do any good. Another hat sat on Bartholomew's head. He took off that hat, after hat, after hat, until he was standing in the middle of a great pile of hats. The lords and noblemen were so astonished they couldn't even speak. Such a thing had never happened in the throne room before. So there's little Bartholomew in the doorway, everybody watching, and the king looking very upset. Heavens, Sir Alaric, keeper of the records, blinking behind his triangular spectacles. He was taken off 45. And there were 3 more down in town, said the king. And you must add on 87 more that blew off my head as we galloped up the hill, said Bartholomew, trying to be helpful. 135 hats. Most unusual, said Sir Alaric. writing it down on a long scroll. Come, come, said the king impatiently. Sir Alaric, what do you make of all this nonsense? Very serious nonsense, your majesty, answered Sir Alaric. I advise you to call in an expert on hats. Excellent, agreed the king. Ho, guard, fetch Sir Snips, maker of hats for all the fine lords. Into the throne room marched the smallest man, wearing the tallest hat that Bartholomew had ever seen. It was Sir Snips. Instead of a sword, he wore at his side a large pair of scissors. Take a look at this boy's hat, commanded the king. Sir Snips looked at Bartholomew Cubbins' hat and sniffed in disgust. Then he turned to the king and bowed stiffly. Your Majesty, I, Sir Snips, am the maker of hats for all the fine lords. I make hats of cloth of gold, the fine silks and gems and ostrich plumes. You ask me what I think of this hat? Pooh! It is the most ordinary hat I'd ever set eyes on. In that case, said the king, it should be very simple for you to take it off. Simple indeed, mumbled Sir Snaps haughtily, and standing on his tiptoes, he pushed his pudgy thumb at Bartholomew's hat and knocked it to the floor. Immediately, another appeared on Bartholomew's head. So if you look really down there at the bottom, well, at the top you see him counting all the hats, but if you look there, that little tiny guy is Sir Snips. Screamy, screamed Sir Snips, leaping into the air higher than he was tall, and then he turned and ran shrieking out of the throne room. Dear me, said the king, looking very puzzled. If Snips can't do it, this must be more than an ordinary hat. 136, wrote Sir Alaric, wrinkling his brow. Your Majesty, I advise you to call in your wise men. Fine idea, said the king. Ho, guard, bring me Nad. Nad knows about everything in all my kingdom. In came an old man. He looked at the hat on Bartholomew's head, and he looked at the pile of hats on the floor. Nad, my wise man, can you take off his hat? Asked the king. Nad shook his head solemnly. Solemnly, no. Then fetch me the father of Nad. Commanded the king. He knows all about everything in all my kingdom and in all the world beyond. In came an even older man. But when he looked at Bartholomew's hat, the father of Nad merely locked his fingers across his beard and said nothing. So in the first picture over here, you see Sir Snips hightailing it out of the throne room. And then you see Nad and father of Nad. Then bring me the father of Nad, ordered the king. He knows about everything in all my kingdom and all the world beyond and all other worlds that may happen to be. Then came the oldest man of them all, but he just looked at Bartholomew and nibbled nervously at the end of his beard. Does this mean there is no one in my whole kingdom who can take off this boy's hat? Bellowed the king in a terrifying voice. A small voice came up through the balcony window. What's the matter, Uncle Derwin? To Bartholomew, it sounded like a voice of a boy. The king stepped out to the balcony, leaned over the marble railing. There's a boy in here, just about your age, the king said. He won't take off his hat. Bartholomew tiptoed up behind the king and looked down. There stood a boy with a big lace collar, a very proud little boy with his nose in the air. It was the Grand Duke Wilfrid, nephew of the king. You send him down here, said the Grand Duke. I'll fix him. The king thought for a minute. He pushed back his crown and scratched his head. Well, maybe you can. There's no harm in trying. Take him to the Grand Duke Wilfrid, commanded the king, and the two of the king's own guards led Bartholomew out of the throne room. So there's the father of Nad, chewing on his beard, and there is Grand Duke Wilfrid at the bottom below the balcony. Pooh, said the Grand Duke Wilfrid, looking at Bartholomew's hat and laughing meanly. That hat won't come off. You stand over there. He pointed to a corner where the wall curved. I need a little target practice with my bow and arrow. When Bartholomew saw that the Grand Duke Wilfrid had only a child's bow, he didn't feel frightened. He spoke up proudly. I can shoot with my father's big bow. My bow is plenty big enough for shooting hats, especially hats like yours, answered Wilfrid. And he let fly an arrow. Zip! And it grazed Bartholomew's forehead and nipped off his hat. Away it blew, and over the parapet. But another hat appeared on his head. Zip, 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 the arrows flew till the Grand Duke's whole bag of arrows was gone, and still a hat set upon Bartholomew's head. It's not fair, cried the Grand Duke. It's not fair. He threw down his bow and stamped upon it. 154 hats, gulped Sir Alaric. So we saw the Grand Duke over here. It's all the hats flying off with arrows in them. These hats are driving me mad, the king's voice rang out through all the palace. Why waste time with a child's bow and arrow? Fetch me the mightiest bow and arrow in all the realm. Fetch the yeoman of the bowmen. The yeoman of the bowmen, echoed all the lords and noblemen of the court. A gigantic man strode across the terrace. His bow was as big as the branch of a tree. The arrow was twice as long as Bartholomew, and thicker than his wrist. Yeoman of the bowmen, said the king, shoot off this boy's hat and make it stay off. Bartholomew was trembling so hard he could scarcely stand straight. The yeoman bent back his mighty bow, like a mad giant hornet. The arrow tore through the air towards Bartholomew Cubbins. Zrub-zap! The sharp arrowhead bit through the hat and carried it off, and on for a full mile. Zrub! It plunked to a stop in the heart of an oak tree. Yet there, on Bartholomew's head, sat another hat. The face of the yeoman of the bowmen went white as the palace walls. It's black magic, he shrieked. So there's the bowman, and there's the arrow through the hat into the oak tree. Black magic, that's just what it is, sighed the king with relief. I should have thought of that before. That makes things simple. Back to the throne room. Call my magicians. In the whole throne room, there wasn't a sound as loud as a breath, but from the spiral stairs that led down from the southwest tower came the shuffling of slow, padded feet. The magicians were coming. Low and slow, they were chanting words that were strange. Dig a hole 5 furlongs deep, down to where the night snakes creep. Mix and mold the mystic mud. Mulber, titter, tud. In came 7 black-gowned magicians. Beside each one stalked a lean black cat. They circled around Bartholomew Cubbins, muttering deep and mysterious sounds. Stop this useless muttering, ordered the king. I want a champ that will charm away this boy's hat. The musicians huddled over Bartholomew and chanted, Winkybus, Tinkybus, Fuchi Kele, hat on this demon's head, fly far away. Howlmen, howl away, howl away, howl away. Yowcats, yowl away, yowl away, yowl away. Hat on this demon's head. Seep away, creep away, leap away, never come back. So there's the cats, the magicians, and Bartholomew in between them. Mighty good chance, said the king, looking very pleased. Are you sure it will work? All the magicians nodded together. But, said the king, looking puzzled, there still seems to be a hat upon his head. How long will it take for the charm to work? Be calm, O sire, have no fear, chanted the magicians. Our charm will work in 10 short years. 10 years, gasped the king. Away, fools, he shouted, out of my sight. I can't wait 10 years to get rid of his hat. Oh dear, what can I do? What can I do? If I were king, whispered Grand Duke Wilfred, I'd chop off his head. A dreadful thought, said the king, biting his lip, but I'm afraid I'll have to. Young man, he said to Bartholomew Cubbins, and he pointed to a small door at the end of the room, march down those steps to the dungeons and tell the executioner to chop off your head. Bartholomew's heart sank into his boots, but he did as the king commanded. I must take off my hat, he said to himself as he started down the long black stairway. This is my last chance. Hat after another he tore from his head. 156, 157, 158. It grew colder and damper. 217, 218, 219. Down, down, down. 231, 232, 233. It seemed to Bartholomew he must be at the very heart of the mountain. Who's there? Said a voice from the blackness. Bartholomew turned a corner and stepped into the dungeon. So there's Grand Duke Wilfred kind of telling the king that he just should chop off his head. The executioner was whistling and swinging his axe idly, because at the moment he had nothing to do. In spite of his business, he really seemed to be a very pleasant man. The king says you must chop off my head, said Bartholomew. Oh, I'd hate to, said the executioner, looking at him with a friendly smile. You seem like such a nice boy. Well, the king says you have to, said Bartholomew, so please get it over with. All right, sighed the executioner, but first, we gotta take off your hat. Why? Asked Bartholomew. I don't know, said the executioner, but it's one of the rules. I can't execute anyone with his hat on. All right, said Bartholomew, you take it off for me. The executioner leaned across the chopping block and flipped off Bartholomew's hat. What's this? He gasped, blinking through the holes of his mask as another hat sat on Bartholomew's head. He flipped this one off, then another, then another. So there he is at the chopping block. The executioner, his big axe, flipping off the hats. Fiddlesticks, grunted the executioner, throwing his axe onto the floor. I can't execute you at all. And he shook hands with Bartholomew and sent him back upstairs to the king. The king had been taking a nap on the throne. What are you doing back here? He said to Bartholomew, angry at being awakened. I'm sorry, your majesty, explained Bartholomew. My head can't come off with my hat on. It's against the rules. So it can't, said the king, leaning back wearily. Now, how many hats does that make altogether? The executioner knocked off 13, and I had left 178 more on the dungeon steps, answered Bartholomew. 346 hats, mumbled Sir Alaric from behind his scrolls. Uncle Derwin, yawned the Grand Duke Wilfred. I suppose I'll just do away with him. Send him up to the highest turret, and I, in person, will push him off. Wilfred, I'm surprised at you, said the king, but I guess it's a good idea. So the king and the Grand Duke led Bartholomew Cubbins towards the highest turret. Up and up and up the turret stairs he climbed behind them. This is my last, very last chance, thought Bartholomew. He snatched off his hat. 347. He snatched off another. He pulled and tore, and he flung them behind him. 398, 399. His arms ached from pulling off the hats, but still the hats came. Bartholomew climbed on. 448, 449, 450, counted Sir Alaric, puffing up the stairs behind him. So there's all the hats, and the executioner letting him go. So he got out of that one, but now they're going to take him up and push him. Yep, look, there he is, going up the stairs with all the hats. Sir Alaric behind him. Suddenly, Sir Alaric stopped. He looked. He took off his triangle spectacles and wiped them on his sleeve, and then he looked again. The hats had begun to change. Hat 451 had not one, but two feathers. Hat 42 had three, and hat 453 also had three and a little red jewel. Each new hat was fancier than the hat just before. Your Majesty, cried out Sir Alaric. But the king and the Grand Duke were way up where they couldn't hear. They had already reached the top of the highest turret, and Bartholomew was following just behind. Step right out here and get on that wall, snapped the Grand Duke. I can't wait to push you off. So, as we already saw him behind him, but look, the hats are different. But when Bartholomew stepped up to the wall, they gasped in amazement. He was wearing the most beautiful hat they had ever seen in the kingdom of Did. It had a ruby larger than any of the king himself had ever owned. It had ostrich plumes and cockatoo plumes and mockingbird plumes and paradise plumes. Besides such a hat, even the king's crown seemed like nothing. The Grand Duke Wilfred took a step towards Bartholomew and thought his end had come at last. Wait, shouted the king. He could not take his eyes off the magnificent hat. I won't wait, the Grand Duke talked back to the king. I'm going to push him off now. The new big hat makes me madder than ever, and he flung his arms to push Bartholomew off. So there's the Grand Duke all upset, and there's that beautiful hat. But the king was quicker than Wilfred. He grabbed him by the back of his fine lace collar. This is to teach you, his Majesty said sternly, that Grand Dukes never talk back to their king. And he turned the Grand Duke Wilfred over his knee and spanked him soundly, right on the seat of his royal silk pants. And now, smiled the king, lifting Bartholomew down from the wall, it would be nice if you could sell me that wonderful hat. 498, 499, broke in the tired voice of Sir Alaric, who just arrived at the top of the steps, and that, he pointed to the hat on Bartholomew's head, makes exactly 500. 500, exclaimed the king. Will you sell it for 500 gold pieces? Anything you say, sire, answered Bartholomew. You see, I've never sold one before. The king's hand trembled with joy as he reached for the hat, and slowly, Bartholomew felt the weight of the great hat lifting from his head, and he held his breath. Then he felt the cool evening breeze blow through his hair. His face broke into a happy smile. The head of Bartholomew Cubbins was bare. Look, your Majesty, look, he shouted to the king. So there's the kid getting ready to push him off, but the king stopped him and then gave him a good old spanking. No, you look at me, answered the king, as he put the great hat on right over his crown. Arm in arm, the king and Bartholomew went down to the counting room to count out the gold. Then the king sent Bartholomew home to his parents. no basket on his arm, no hat on his head, but with 500 pieces of gold in a bag. And the king commanded that the hat he had bought, and all the other hats too, be kept forever in a crystal case by the side of his throne. But neither Bartholomew Cubbins, nor King Derwin himself, nor anyone else in the kingdom of Did, could ever explain how this strange thing had happened. They only could say it just happened to happen, and was not very likely to happen again. So there's the king and Bartholomew. The king had that great hat, and there's Bartholomew going home with the cash. Okay, well, that's the end of that one. Like I said, I have never actually read this one before. 500 Hats of Bartholomew. What do you guys think? Does it reach up there as one of your favorite Dr. Seuss books? I liked it, but I think I like others better. I have some other ones. Our next book is actually his first book. So that one, I think, was the second one. His first one. I actually like this one. And it's called And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street by Dr. Seuss. There it is. There he is on Mulberry Street, right there. When I leave home to walk to school, Dad always says to me, Marco, keep your eyelids up and see what you can see. But when I tell him where I've been and what I think I've seen, he looks at me and sternly says, your eyesight's much too keen. Stop telling such outlandish tales, stop turning minnows into wells. Now what can I say when I get home today? There's Marco walking home from school. Excuse me. All along the way to school and all the way back, I've looked and I've kept careful track. But all that I've noticed, except my own feet, was a horse and a wagon on Mulberry Street. This is horse and his wagon that he saw on his way to school. There's nothing to tell of that won't do, of course. Just a broken down wagon that's drawn by a horse. That can't be my story, that's only the start. I'll say that a zebra was pulling that cart, and that is a story that no one can beat when I say that I saw it on Mulberry Street. Yes, the zebra is fine, but I think it's a shame, such a marvelous beast with a cart that's so tame. The story would really be better to hear if the driver I saw were a charioteer, and gold and blue chariot something to me, rumbling like thunder down Mulberry Street. So there's the zebra and the chariot. No, it won't do it all. A zebra's too small. A reindeer is better. He's fast and he's fleet, and he'd look mighty smart on old Mulberry Street. So now we have the reindeer pulling that chariot. Hold on a minute. There's something wrong. A reindeer hates the way it feels to pull a thing that runs on wheels. He'd be much happier instead if he could pull a fancy sled. A reindeer and sleigh. Say, anyone can think of that. Jack or Fred or Joe or Nat. Say, even Jane could think of that. But it isn't too late to make one little change. A sleigh and an elephant? There's something strange. I'll pick one with plenty of power and size, a blue one with plenty of fun in his eyes, and then, just to give him a little more tone, have a Rajah with rubies perched high on a throne. Say, that makes a story that no one can beat when I say that I saw it on Mulberry Street. But now I don't know. It still doesn't seem right. An elephant pulling a thing so light, we would whip it around in the air like a kite. But he'd look mighty grand with a great big brass band. Band that's so good should have someone to hear it, but it's going so fast that it's hard to keep near it. I'll put on a trailer. I know they won't mind if a man sits and listens while hitched on behind. But now, is it fair? Is it fair what I've done? I'll bet those wagons weigh more than a ton. That's really too heavy a load for one beast. I'll give him some helpers. He needs two at least. So there's the wagon, the little house behind it, the guy listening to the big band, and then two helpers, which look like two giraffes. But now what worries me is this. Mulberry Street runs into Bliss. Unless there's something I can fix up, there will be an awful traffic mix-up. So, Mulberry Street and Bliss Street, the corner. It takes police to do the trick, to guide them through where traffic's thick. It takes police to do the trick. They'll never crash now. They'll race at top speed with Sergeant Mulvaney himself in the lead. So, it's getting grander and grander. The mayor is there. He thinks it is grand. As he raises his hand and they dash by the stand. The mayor is there and the aldermen too, all waving big banners of red, white, and blue. And that is the story that no one can beat when I say that I saw it on Mulberry Street. With a roar of its motor, an airplane appears and dumps out confetti while everyone cheers. And that makes the story that's really not bad, but it still could be better. Suppose that I add. I'm not sure how that's going to get better. It looks pretty fun to me. A Chinese man who eats with sticks, a big magician doing tricks, a 10-foot beard that needs a comb. No time for more, I'm almost home. I swung around the corner and dashed through the gate. I ran up the steps and I felt really simply great, for I had a story that no one could beat, and to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street. But Dad said quite calmly, just draw up your stool and tell me the sights on the way home from school. There's so much to tell, I just couldn't begin. Dad looked at me sharply and pulled at his chin. He frowned at me sternly from there in the seat. Was there nothing to look at? No people to greet? Did nothing excite you or make your heart beat? He's at home, running up the stairs. Marco's all excited about his story. Nothing, I said, growing red as a beet, but a plain horse and wagon on Mulberry Street. So he ended up telling the truth. I always like this one because it's all about using your imagination. And as a kid, I always used my imagination. All right, don't worry, we have a couple more to go. But like I said, this is his very first book that he made. And it's not my favorite all time, but I really do like this one. All right, our next book. It's kind of a newer one, if I remember right. That they found. I have to look it up. I can't remember. But it's called Daisy Head Mazie. It's another one that most people have never heard. Daisy Head Mazie by Dr Seuss. There she is. I'm guessing she's called Daisy Head Mazie because there's a daisy in her head. It's hard to believe such things could be true, and I hope such things never happen to you. But it happened to say to poor Mazie McGrew, and it happened like this. So our narrator's the cat, at least. We all know him, and there's a door for some reason. She was sitting one day at her desk in her school in her usual way when she felt a small twitch at the top of her head. So Mazie looked up and she almost dropped dead. Something peculiar was going on there. A daisy was sprouting right out of her hair. Behind her was sitting young Herman Butch Strudel. This looks like a daisy up here on her noodle. It doesn't make sense why it couldn't be so. A noodle's no place for a daisy to grow. Then up spoke another boy, Einstein von Tass, the brightest young man in the whole of the class. It's a very odd place to be sprouting a daisy, but nevertheless one is growing on Mazie. Hey, look it, cried Butch, right here in this room. Daisy had Mazie, she's bursting in bloom. Miss Nietzsche, the teacher, came rushing up quick. Such nonsense, some child here playing a trick. Which one of you boys stuck that thing in her hair? You know that a daisy could never grow there. But teacher, said Butch, I saw the thing rise right out of her head with my very own eyes. Just give it a yank if you think I tell lies. So there they are looking around at Daisy's, or Mazie's Daisy. But Miss Nietzsche had heard quite enough of this talk. Mazie, hold still, let me get at the stock. Ouch, hollered Mazie. Quit yanking, Butch said. You're giving her pains. I'll bet that those roots go way down in her brains. The kids in the class started shouting like crazy. Daisy head, Daisy head, Daisy head, Mazie. Children, be quiet, good grief, and alas. Miss Nietzsche was shocked by the noise in her class. I've taught in this room 20 years, maybe more, but I've never seen anything like this before. I have to report it. You'll just have to come to the principal's office and show Mr. Grum. There's Daisy, the teacher, taking her to the principal's office. Now the principal, good Mr. Gregory Grum, was a very wise man, just as smart as they come. He knew more than anyone else in the nation about long division and multiplication. He knew all the answers, why oceans are deep, why skies are so high, why mountains are steep. He should have the answer to this thing on Mazie. My word, he declared, it's a genuine daisy. I've seen them quite often in fields growing wild, but never before on the head of a child. Now what in the world ever made this thing sprout? I have no idea, but I'm going to find out. It says daisies grow on the land. They grow between rocks. They grow also in sand. It mentions right here they can grow in a pot, but mention the head of a girl, it does not. Daisies, it says, sometimes grow in Alaska, also Missouri, Rhode Island, Nebraska. They grow in Japan and in Spain and Peru, in India, France, and in Idaho too. They grow in South Boston and also in Rome. But why should they grow on this little girl's dome? So he's researching. No idea why Mazie has a daisy. Say, look it, says Mazie. It's wilting, it's drooping. How wonderful, Mazie. It soon will be dead, but you'll be rid of that daisy. In just a few minutes, our trouble will pass, declared Mr. Grum. Take her back to her class. Then the principal saw a most terrible sight. The daisy was dying, and that was all right. But that daisy was part of poor Mazie McGrew, and Mazie was starting to wilt away too. The teacher, said Grum, you know what I think? They're both going to die. Hurry, bring them a drink. That daisy, that girl's the worst problem in town. You take her away and you make her lie down. You lock her up tight in that room down the hall. There's quite a few numbers I've got to call. Get Mazie's parents on the end of this line. I need them here quickly while there still is time. On the phone, Mazie's mom asked, what's all the fuss? Then goodness to Betsy, I'll catch the next bus. A call to the shoe store reached Mr. McGrew. He answered while holding a customer's shoe. Yes, this is, oh no, I really must go. So there's her parents. A doctor should see her, the principal said, an expert on plants like the one on her head. So he called Dr. Eisenbach, who said, what a trick. My stethoscope's packed. I'll be there in a tick. Wait, Doc, said his patients. I'll come along too. My brother's a vet, and he knows this McGrew. When he heard Finch the florist grabbed for his shears, I'll be there just as soon as my truck can shift gears. So there's the two experts coming, the doctor and the florist. Meanwhile, poor Mazie lay down on a couch. The daisy slumped down on its leaves in a slouch, but the window was open because it was warm, and the sweet-smelling daisy attracted a swarm of bees. Buzz, bees, bees. Well, there she is laying down, and all the bees coming to get her. The faster she ran, the faster they flew, so Mazie kept running. What else could she do? She attempted to hide behind Officer Thatcher, who cupped out his hand like a bumblebee catcher. The bees took his hat. Thatcher said, I'm no fool, and ran after Mazie back to the school. So they're still chasing her. Principal Grum didn't know what to do. It's worse, cried Miss Snitcher. Much worse than we feared. The Daisy and Mazie have both disappeared. Behind her came charging Mr. McGrew, chased by a customer chasing his shoe. Finch the floor is Dr. Eisenbart, too. That's an arts... Dr. Eisenbart's patient and Miss McGrew. So here's all the people come running to the store to see the principal. Through the window with Officer Thatcher, who slammed the pane shut so the bees couldn't catch her, jumped Mazie McGrew to the floor in a splatter, with the Daisy still there, except taller and fatter. My poor little daughter, the Daisy, it's true, I'm going to faint, cried Mrs. McGrew. Tut, 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 said the florist, there's no need for tears, just because there's a daisy between her two ears. I'll snip it right off with my sharp pruning shears. She's my patient, don't touch her, you must stand apart. We have to have room, said Dr. Eisenbart. I think that Mazie and her plant could help me get a research grant. Well, now that all the adults are arguing. Then the door opened wide, and the mayor stepped inside. At a meeting and greetings, there was none to compare. He was best at long speeches, clocked full of hot air. I promise, my friends, that if I'm re-elected, this Daisy on Mazie will be disconnected. The law of our fathers is simple and sound. Daisies belong and should stay in the ground. The rest are illegal. We'll bar them from town. From the back came a voice, sometimes loud, sometimes slick, of a wheeler and dealer who knew every trick. I am Finlandi, the Fiegal, the agent. You've heard of me, I'm sure. I represent Young, what's his name, and others now on tour. But Mazie, you're so special. Please let me shake your hand. Your talent is a wondrous thing, unique in all the land. Daisy had Mazie spelled out in bright lights. Will draw kids in the day and parents at night. Daisy had Mazie, you've got quite an act. Just stick with me, kid, and sign this contract. Your flower needs to sign, too. These adults are very nice. Her mother said, Daisy, don't be a fool, and the principal begged her not to leave school. But Mazie didn't stop to blink. She signed her name in a thank-proof ink. And then the Daisy signed too. Daisy had fever, was gripping the nation, had quickly become a worldwide sensation. So everyone's wearing daisies on their head now. Daisy had burgers and Daisy had drinks. Daisy had stockings and Daisy had stinks. Daisy had buttons and Daisy had bows. Mazie was famous, the star of her shows. Fame had knocked on Mazie's door, and now she had it all and more. Piles of money and stacked in tins. Everything. Daisy everything. But what is money without friends? The dream had led her far astray. That was the price she had to pay. Mazie McGrew ran night and day, nowhere to go, nowhere to stay. But she was sure that everywhere must have written her off in total disgust. Over and over again in her head, these are the words that poor Mazie said, I can never go home. Nobody loves me. Nobody loves me. Nobody loves me. And there she is running away from fame because she misses her friends and her family. Nobody loved her. Poor Mazie McGrew. It's hard to believe such a thing could be true, and maybe that's why, then, this Daisy above, when Mazie below began talking of love, well, you know about daisies when love is in doubt. The job of the Daisy is to try and find out. They love her not. They love her not. Doing that old they love her thing. Don't worry, Mazie. They love you. They love me. So the last one was they love you. And she is happy to see her family and friends again. Well, that's how it all happened. The thing went away. And Mazie McGrew is quite happy today, back at her studies and doing just great in all of her subjects in room number 8. And concerning that Daisy, you know that it never grew out of the top of her head again, ever. Well, practically never popped up there again, excepting occasionally, just now and then. So there she is studying, and there's the Daisy back. And after all, I am getting used to it. All right, hope you guys like that one. I mean, that's a fun one too. We'll have one more book. Hi guys. All right, for our last Dr. Seuss book, for this year at least, I'm going to read classic that everybody knows, Horton Hears a Who. Horton Hears a Who by Dr. Seuss. On the 15th of May, in the jungle of Newell, in the heat of the day, in the cool of the pool, he was splashing and enjoying the jungle's great joys when Horton the elephant heard a small noise. There he is. So Horton stopped splashing. He looked towards the sound. That's funny, thought Horton. There's no one around. Then he heard it again, just a very faint yelp, as if some tiny person was calling for help. I'll help you, said Horton. But who are you? Where? He looked and he looked. He could see nothing there but a small peck of dust blowing past through the air. So there he is, and if you look right there, it's a small speck of dust. I say, murmured Horton, I've never heard tell of a small speck of dust that's able to yell. So you know what I think? Why I think that there must be someone on top of that small speck of dust, some sort of creature of very small size, too small to be seen by an elephant's eyes. But Horton looking really close at that small, but you guys probably can't see it on the camera. That's how small it is right there. Some poor little person who's shaking with fear that he'll blow in the pool. He has no way to steer. I'll just have to save him because, after all, a person's a person, no matter how small. Well, there's a little person riding on the dust. So gently, and using the greatest of care, the elephant stretched his great trunk through the air. He lifted the dust speck and carried it over, and placed it down safe on a very soft clover. That's so nice of Horton. The voice. 'Twas a sour kangaroo, and the young kangaroo in her pouch said, too. Why, that speck is as small as the head of a pin. A person on that? Why, there's never been. And there's that sour kangaroo. Doesn't believe Horton. Believe me, said Horton, I tell you sincerely, my ears are quite keen, and I heard them quite clearly. I know there's a person down there, and what's more, quite likely there's two, even three, even four. Quite likely. A family for all that we know, a family with children just starting to grow. So please, Horton said, as a favor to me, try not to disturb them. Just let them be. So there's that family on top of the dust. I think you're a fool, laughed the sour kangaroo, and the young kangaroo in her pouch said, me too. You're the biggest blame fool in the jungle of Newell. And the kangaroo plunged in the cool of the pool. What terrible splashing, the elephant frowned. I can't let my very small persons get drowned. I got to protect them, I'm bigger than they. So he plucked up the clover and hustled away. There he is protecting the clover with the dust on it, and there's the two kangaroos. Through the high jungle treetops, the news quickly spread. He talked to a dust speck. He was out of his head. Just look at him walk with that speck on that flower. And Horton walked, worrying almost an hour. Should I put this speck down? Horton thought with alarm. If I do, these small persons may come to great harm. I can't put it down, and I won't, after all. A person's a person, no matter how small. There he is walking through the jungle with his little flower. The monkey's laughing at him. Then Horton stopped walking. The speck voice was talking. The voice was so faint he could barely hear it. Speak up, please, said Horton. He put his ear near it. My friend, came the voice, you are a very fine friend. You've helped all us folks on this dust speck no end. You've saved all our homes, our ceilings and floors. You've saved all our churches and grocery stores. So they're very, very quiet talking to him. You mean, Horton gasped, you have buildings there too? Oh yes, piped the voice, we most certainly do. I know, called the voice, I'm too small to be seen, but I'm mayor of a town that is friendly and clean. Our buildings to you would seem terribly small, but to us who aren't big, they are wonderfully tall. My town is called Whoville, for I am a Who, and we Whos are all thankful and grateful to you. And Horton called back to the mayor of the town. You're safe now. Don't worry. I won't let you down. There's the town of Whoville. We've heard of Whoville because we've seen it in other movies. But just as he spoke to the mayor of the speck, 3 big jungle monkeys climbed up Horton's neck. The Wickersham brothers came shouting, "What not? This elephant's talking to Whos who are not. There aren't any Whos, and they don't have a mayor, and we're going to stop all this nonsense, so there." Oh, see, those brothers are going to bother the dust speck. They snatched Horton's clover. They carried it off to a black-bottomed eagle named Vladivkov, a mighty strong eagle of very swift wing, and they said, "Will you kindly get rid of this thing?" And before the poor elephant could even speak, the eagle flew off with a flower in his beak. All that late afternoon and far into the night, that black-bottomed bird flapped his wings in fast flight, while Horton chased after with groans over stones that tattered his toenails and battered his bones, and begged, "Please don't harm all my little folks, who have as much right to live as us bigger folks too." But far beyond him, that eagle kept flapping, and over his shoulder called back, "Quit your yapping. I'll fly the night through. I'm a bird. I don't mind it. I'll hide this tomorrow. You'll never find it." All right, time, and poor Horton's trying to catch the bird. And at 6:56 the next morning, he did it. It sure was a terrible place that he hid it. He let that small clover drop somewhere inside of a great patch of clover 100 miles wide. "Find that," sneered the bird, "but I think you will fail." And he left with a flip of the black-bottomed tail. So, Cloverfield. It's going to be really hard to find that clover in all those clovers. "I'll find it," cried Horton. "I'll find it or bust. I shall find my friends on a small speck of dust." And clover by clover with care, he picked up and searched them and called, "Are you there?" But clover by clover, he found that the one he sought for was just not around. And by noon, poor old Horton, more dead than alive, had picked and searched and piled up 9,005. Not having any luck, guys. Then on through the afternoon, hour after hour, till he found them at last on their 3 millionth flower. "My friends," cried the elephant, "tell me, do tell, are you safe? Are you sound? Are you whole? Are you well?" So he finally found his friends. Let me look at all those ones he had to go through to find them now. From down on the speck came the voice of the mayor. "We really had trouble, much more than our share. When that black-bottomed birdie let go and we dropped, we landed so hard that all our clocks have stopped. Our teapots are broken, our rocking chairs smashed, and our bicycle tires all blew up when we crashed. So Horton, please," pleaded that voice of the mayor, "will you stick by us Whos while we're making repairs?" "Of course," Horton answered. "Of course I will stick. I will stick by you small folks through thin and through thick." So their village was damaged by that eagle, and so now they're fixing it. And Horton has promised to help them. "Humph," humped the voice. "For almost 2 days you've run wild and insisted on chatting with persons who never existed. Such carrying on in our peaceable jungle. We've had quite enough of your bellowing bungle. And I'm here to state," snapped the big kangaroo, "that your silly nonsensical game is all through." And the young kangaroo in her pouch said, "Me too." So they don't believe Horton still. But we know better. With the help of the Wickersham brothers and dozens of Wickersham uncles and Wickersham cousins and Wickersham in-laws whose help I've engaged, you are going to be roped and you're going to be caged. And as for your dust speck, that we shall boil in a hot steaming kettle of bezelnut oil." "Boil it?" gasped Horton. "Oh, that you can't do. It's all full of persons. They'll prove it to you." So they're going to rope him up, put him in a cage, and boil the dust speck, which we know has Whos on it. Mr. Mayor, Horton called. Mr. Mayor, you've got to prove now that you really are there. So call a big meeting, get everyone out, make every who holler and make every who shout, make every who scream, and if you don't, every who is going to end up in the basil nut stew. So, poor Horton. And down on the dust speck, the scared little mayor called a big meeting in Whoville Town Square, and his people cried loudly. They cried out in fear, "We are here, we are here, we are here, we are here." So there they all trying to yell, "We are here." The elephant smiled. That was clear as a bell. Your kangaroo surely heard that very well. All I heard, snapped the big kangaroo, was the breeze and the faint sound of wind through the far distant trees. I heard no small voices, and you didn't either. And the young kangaroo in her pouch said, "Me neither." So they're getting closer. "Grab him," they shouted, and cage the big dope. Lasso his stomach with 10 miles of rope. Tie the knots tight so he'll never shake loose. Then dunk that dumb speck in the basil nut juice. Horton fought back with a great vigor and vim, but the Wickersham gang was too many for him. They beat him, they mauled him, they started to haul him into his cage, but he managed to call to the mayor, "Don't give up, I believe in you all. A person's a person, no matter how small, and you very small persons will not have to die if you make yourselves heard, so come on now and try." All right, so they got him tied up. They're pulling him into the cage. The mayor grabbed a tom-tom. He started to smack it, and all over Whoville they whipped up a racket. They rattled tin kettles. They beat on brass pans, on garbage pail tops and old cranberry cans. They blew on bazookas and blasted great root toots, on clarinets, oompas, and boompas, and flutes. There's our little who guys. They're trying. Great gust of loud racket rang high through the air. They rattled and shook the whole sky. And the mayor called up through the howling mad hullabaloo, "Hey Horton, how's this? Is our sound coming through?" And Horton called back, "I can hear you just fine, but the kangaroo's ears are as strong and quiet as mine. They don't hear a thing, and you're sure all your boys are doing their best? Are they all making noise? Are you sure every who down in Whoville is working? Quick, look through your town. Is there anyone shirking?" So there's all the horns. They're trying. If you really want it to go. Through the town rushed the mayor from east to west, but everyone seemed to be doing his best. Everyone seemed to be yapping and yipping. Everyone seemed to be beeping and bipping. But it wasn't enough, all this ruckus and roar. He had to find some place to help him make more. He raced through each building. He searched floor to floor. So there he is. He's looking for anybody that might not be doing it. And just as he felt he was getting nowhere, almost about to give up in despair, he suddenly busted through a door, and that mayor discovered one shirker quite hidden away in the Fairfax apartment 12J. A very small, very small shirker named Jojo was standing and bouncing a yo-yo. Not making a sound, not a yeep, not a chirp, and the mayor rushed inside and he grabbed the young twerp. There he is. And he climbed with the lad up to Eiffelberg Tower. "This," cried the mayor, "is your town's darkest hour, the time for all who have bloodshed that is red, to come in to the aid of their country," he said. "We've got to make noises in greater amounts, so open your mouth, lad, for every voice counts." Thus he spoke as he climbed. When they got to the top, the lad cleared his throat, and he shouted out, "Yop!" There he is. He yelled, "Yop!" All the other noises. And that yop, that one small extra yop, put it over. Finally, at last, from that speck on that clover, their voices were heard. They rang out clear and clean, and the elephant smiled. "Do you see what I mean? They've proved they are persons, no matter how small, and their whole world was saved by the smallest of all." "How true, yes, how true," said the big kangaroo. "And from now on, You know what I'm planning to do? From now on, I'm going to protect them with you. And the young kangaroo in her pouch said, what do you think the young kangaroo said? Me too. From sun in the summer, from rain when it's fallish, I'm going to protect him no matter how smallish. So, I guess actually a picture. They are protecting him. Like I said, classic Dr. Seuss book right here. There's a movie based on it. There's shorts, animated features, about other books, and there's other movies. So I recommend going out and watching them today for his birthday. I also recommend going on YouTube or where there's a Blu-ray, something you might be able to find, but it's hard to find. It's called In Search of Dr. Seuss, and it has all kinds of great background information about who he is and how he came to be. So I hope you enjoyed our Dr. Seuss books, and I will see you soon.